Hello, my name is Bea Copin, and you are watching Rappler. Today, we are joined by Pulse Asia President and political scientist Ronald Holmes to talk about the latest Pulse Asia Ulat ng Bayan survey covering the performance and trustworthiness ratings of top government officials, including President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Vice President Sara Duterte. Let's go through that survey, not naman per table, but to get a better understanding of what it means for the administration, even the opposition, and most especially the average Filipino. Hello, Ronald. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Bea. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, let's go straight to the first thing I actually texted or asked you after the Ulat, that portion at least of the Ulat ng Bayan survey came out. President Marcos enjoys high ratings in terms of performance and trustworthiness, 78% approval, 80% trust, marginally higher, nabanggit mo nga kanina, than the former President Duterte. And yet, when you ask respondents naman to rate how the admin has performed on certain issues, the net approval rating was negative on controlling inflation, which they said was the most urgent among the issues that you presented to them in the survey. How do we make sense of that? Na ang baba niya sa top issue, pero ang taas ng trustworthiness at performance rating niya as president?
May differentiation, Bea, in terms of rating him as a president and the entire administration. That means basically he is not yet being held accountable for the high prices of commodities. Although, I mean, you would expect that will come sometime soon.
Yeah.
Certain things are not in any way attended to.
Yeah.
I think to a certain extent, maybe the public know that the pressures that we're having right now with regard to the economy, more specifically the high prices, is something that is also extraneously induced, by the continuing war in Ukraine. So in that sense, it's almost similar to the rating of former President Duterte during the pandemic, when he actually retained his approval despite the fact that many felt that the initiatives taken by the administration then were quite deficient with regard to addressing those who were affected by the pandemic.
Yeah. This disconnect, at least to me, it's a disconnect between the administration and the head of the administration, because you would think that as the head, you would be, kumbaga, emblematic of how the administration performs or what the administration does.
It means that people basically do not in any way think of it as a command responsibility issue, Bea.
Yeah.
That the collective might be a problem, but the president remains performing his role, or they are appreciative of him performing his role.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, I mean, you can say that it's perplexing. Why is he not being held accountable for the performance of an administration that he should be coordinating or leading?
Yeah, especially because he is concurrently the agriculture secretary, and inflation is, for at least for the cost of food items, is part of his responsibility, no?
Yes, and more specifically with the promise he made during, I think, the inauguration or the SONA, that the price of rice will become 20 pesos per kilo, which has not been the case. No?
Yeah, kahit sa kadiwa, hindi pa umaabot doon. Which actually leads me, to be clear, no, hindi ito phenomenon lang under President Marcos Jr. This happens to a lot of, especially including the president right before him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that you would expect maybe on the first year of the president, that there's a bit more appreciation of the administration because it's new. I remember even under Pinoy, his approval ratings did not decline until closer to the midterm election.
Yeah.
That was in 2013.
Yeah.
In the case of President Duterte, I think the first decline that we saw that was significant was in September 2018. So that was 2 years after he got elected, and that was largely because of the increasing prices of rice, increasing the high price of rice for that matter.
Yeah.
So you see, Filipinos are a bit more patient with regard to their expectations, of how the president should perform.
Yeah. Let's talk about that patience and the grace that Filipinos seemingly offer to presidents, to the president, to people in power. No, there's this term that we in the media and in the political science circles and siguro those who truly care about politics more than the average Filipino, yung honeymoon period na sinasabi nila, after an official is elected. Siguro for those who aren't as dorky and interested in politics as we are, perhaps, Ronald, like, what does that even mean? Like, what do you mean when you say the honeymoon period? Who determines how long a honeymoon period is, and like, what does this imply for the administration?
Well, if I use that analogy of a honeymoon period, it basically to me means that one person in that particular relationship, or the relationship between the president and the president appears to be attentive to what the public needs. No, in the same manner that in a honeymoon, one partner, both partners are more attentive to each other's needs. If suddenly there's a reduction in terms of that level of attention, then the other partner might really not like that or dislike that. But in this case, in our case, I think what the presidents have learned so far, and more specifically in the last administration, this administration, is that you can project that you're doing something about many of the problems, and you can explain your deficiencies for that matter. You remember earlier on in the Duterte administration, the president said that I could not in any way rid the country of drugs in the first 6 months of my administration. So basically, he admitted that he would fail in that particular campaign promise. And in that regard, that is something that may be regarded as a projection in terms, not really of incompetence, but really in terms of just simply having the public face the reality that this problem is much more bigger than it is. And he was apologizing, and then that extent, maybe the public accepted that apology, or the public appreciated the honesty. So there's that level of performance that presidents actually can engage in that will keep the public convinced, no, you're still attending to our needs.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up. The performance ratings aren't just about the actual performance, but the perception and siguro how the administration frames the context of which that performance, the performance is rated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, as long as I think one of the things that we've seen, I mean, I'm speaking more as a political scientist than someone who is doing the poll here, is that as long as there's no question as regards the character of the person, there is no serious issue of personal integrity, or the person does not in any way show a lack of empathy, the public basically, there's a low bar of expectation. The public will be appreciative, although that appreciation may shift to indecision later on, but the public would not be that much disapproving or distrusting of a person that they feel is being honest, being himself or herself, and just simply performing their role despite all of the difficulties that they're confronting.
Yeah, speaking about yung pag-frame or yung pag-prioritize ng issues, napansin ko lang na in the last Ulat ng Bayan survey, economy and jobs talaga yung pinaka-top concerns ng mga tao. It's not really unusual in that sense kasi you would think that that'll happen in the aftermath when finally a country starts opening up after years of lockdown. But I just want to contrast that to the Duterte administration where peace and criminality were top concerns, and during naman the administration of the late President Aquino, graft and corruption, good governance were top concerns. These two issues or three issues seemingly aren't as important anymore. So I guess what I'm wondering is the urgency of issues dependent on external forces, or nakasalalay din ba to sa how the administration sets it up or frames it as ito yung pinaka-important sa atin ngayon or sa bansa ngayon?
Yan. Siguro may mga panahon na malaki yung impluwensya ng Pangulo na mabigyan diin yung isang usapin. Katulad ng ginawa ni Pinto sa graft and corruption sa katiwalian ng 2010, katulad ng ginawa ni dating Pangulong Duterte sa kriminalidad. Pero naiiba yung panahon ngayon Bea. Yung signaling, the term that is used by some literature here is the signaling power of the president, that the president can actually influence what the public will feel is important or an important issue based on the emphasis that he gives to that particular issue. But right now, we're really just confronting essentially problems that came about as a result of the pandemic and continue to be problems because of the war. that has disrupted global supply chain, right? Increased the price of oil, for example, for that matter. So in this sense, the signaling power of Marcos, of Bongbong Marcos, has been effectively reduced. He could not do it. He could not do the same thing as what Pinoy did,
Yeah.
or as what Duterte did in 2010. But he has to attend to those four major issues. As you said, apat yun, lahat yun may
Yeah.
patungkol sa
Yeah.
kabuhayan.
Yeah.
Job, pay, poverty, and
Yeah.
inflation.
Yeah.
Graft and corruption remains an urgent concern, but it's basically an urgent concern of about 1 out of 5 Filipinos.
Yeah.
Not as much as it was during in 2010 for that matter.
Yeah. Kumbaga, literal na, almost literal gut issues yung top concern ng mga tao ngayon. Although, I wonder though, because parang from the get-go, the Marcos admin has been framing the economy as their priority. So parang, is this a matter of parang they were attuned also, or they foresaw na ito yung magiging top concern ng mga tao? Or chicken and egg situation ba yun? Like, is it pointless to trace where it started? Bakit ito na talaga yung top concern ng mga tao ngayon?
Well, Bea, you've been following the campaign, and Bongbong Marcos, essentially, the slogan during the campaign before they got into that unity was Bayan, Babang Muli. So, in a sense, from the very start, he was talking about recovery.
Yeah.
And I think it would not be hard for us to really surmise that the reason why they are saying that the economy is top priority is largely because it's really something that will eventually impact on the rating of the administration and the president coming from the public. If these are not attended to, we're seeing an easing in terms of some of the external factors that have brought about, let's say, higher inflation. You've got, for example, investigations of shortages of onions and sugar and what have you, coming from the Senate or the lower house, saying that these are problems that can actually be attended to by the executive, and yet they fail to. No?
Yeah.
So if this continues, then you'd have eventually you can assume that the president may be held accountable for such deficiencies.
Yun na ba yung, kumbaga, is the honeymoon over by then, or iba pa rin iba pa rin yung kwento doon?
Oh, pag meron mga pagpapatunay na wala kang ginagawa, yun, medyo talagang tatamaan na yung Pangulo, no?
Yeah.
Ang masama kasi dito, depende yan dun sa inilalabas ng mga kaaway mo, o depende yan dun sa kalayaan ng mga namamahayag na talagang ilabas yung katotohanan. Pero alam natin, yan, napakahirap ilabas yung katotohanan eh. Kung saan-saan galing yung impormasyon at ang impormasyon ay maaaring hindi ito. So kalaban natin dito yung mga impormasyon na hindi naman totoo, pero nakaka-impluwensya sa kamalayan, kaisip ng mamamayan.
Yeah. There's so much noise out there, and a lot of times it benefits those in power.
Well, I remember, for example, in the Aquino administration, the commitment towards graft and corruption was somehow questioned by just a simple issue, the laglag bala. No? So in that case, if media continues to be free, and if media or legacy media or digital media continue to adhere to the truth, then basically this will provide the public a firm basis of making an objective evaluation of the performance of the administration. But we know that is not the case right now. It's not what we're confronting right now.
Yeah. Sir, putting on your political scientist hat, what should the administration be taking away from the results of the survey, at least this part of the survey? Yun nga, yung parang currently, siguro, people don't hold him directly accountable, the president directly accountable yet for what they see as the failure of the administration to curb or to control inflation. But that's in March. Numbers are kind of easing, they're kind of improving, but parang di rin natin alam, global movements, especially in terms of Ukraine, are quite volatile still. What should they be taking away from the survey?
Well, the thing that they can be attentive to would be essentially the rating of the administration on addressing the issues. No? Unlike the previous administration, unlike the Duterte administration, the Duterte administration retained majority approval across all of these issues that we were performance in March 2017. In the case of the Marcos administration right now, you've got 5 of the 12 issues where they're getting less than majority approval. Uh, if there's a disruption, for example, I mean, knock on wood, it will not happen. No?
Yeah.
If there's more tension and that tension becomes an open conflict in Taiwan, definitely
Yeah.
that will have a significant impact on the economy. So there should be preparations on the part of the administration, and there should be action on the part of the administration to contribute towards a resolution of that potential conflict. Because if that conflict happens, we're really going to be severely affected.
Yeah.
So it's seen in the results that we have right now. The president might be getting majority approval and trust, but that trust and approval, I would have to quote there, I think it was Senate President Enrile who said it at one point in time. It's like ice cream; it can melt down immediately.
Nothing is assured, nothing is forever. How about the opposition, sir? But I say this in the context, it's difficult to speak of the power of an opposition when your Congress is dominated by supermajorities, right? But what can they also take away from the results of the survey?
Well, yeah, as you said, the opposition essentially it's very hard to even define who are in the opposition. Some people in the opposition are saying there's a wait and see game. They're not exactly disgusted with the performance, but they're happy in some instances. But what the opposition should do is really to try to get more involved in terms of political education. You've got a public that might be receptive to information that might be helpful to the administration, might not be true, but the opposition could find ways in terms of really countering that particular narrative. And this is where the opposition has failed over the past years. They basically have been muted insofar as providing that counter narrative. And that counter narrative did not necessarily be something that they will create. It is essentially an expression and a projection, a dissemination of what is truly happening in the country.
Yeah. It's also it's largely also a communication thing, no? And siguro bridging that disconnect between inflation, the performance of the performance of which the administration is controlling inflation, and linking that to the president, who again, besides being the commander-in-chief, hindi lang siya head ng lahat, DA siya mismo. So that should be a challenge for an opposition that's admittedly dejado by a lot to begin with. Ronald, the last time I spoke to you, it was the day after the elections. At that point, partial, unofficial pa yung data, but clearly, Marcos would be president, Duterte would be vice president. But in the lead up to that, there was so much noise and talk criticizing surveys and survey firms, including Pulse Asia. And yet, when the results of the election came in, sobrang kung hindi eksakto sa patterns or sa snapshots taken by survey firms, including the Pulse Asia surveys, then saktong-sakto yun, no? Again, we're hearing doubts or murmurs over the results of the Ulat ng Bayan survey. And I guess that doesn't surprise you anymore. But my question would be, how should the ordinary Filipino understand surveys like these snapshots of public sentiment?
Well, this is public sentiment that is captured at one point in time. It's a public sentiment that may change at another point in time. Surveys have a limitation in that regard. This is a cross-sectional survey, so that means what we found out is only true at the time that we took the survey, collected the data. And the limitation of the survey is that we don't know essentially why is it that people are appreciative or trusting of those individuals. There are other methods that can be used as a social scientist that will probe into that, the reasons behind that trust and approval. But that's something that surveys cannot do. I mean, if you do focus group discussions, if you do ethnographic research, maybe those are the things that can net additional reasons. What we do have to stress, however, is that the survey, as it is a reliable measure of where the people stand with regard to issues, and in this regard, as with respect to the approval and trust of the top national officials.
Kumbaga, it's a guide, not a final judgment of how things are going.
One of my mentors said that, sometimes, I mean, surveys, you can think of yourself as a doctor, who give a diagnosis, but the patients do not like the diagnosis. So what can happen there is that you go to another medical professional who might engage in another method or another protocol. And that's also important.
Yeah.
As I said, surveys are valid instruments to find out what the public feels, but there are other methods it can be used to probe deeper into the reasons behind what we're getting in the surveys.
Yeah, so much to learn for the ordinary Filipino, especially for the opposition, I suppose, from the numbers in the latest Ulat ng Bayan survey. Thank you, Ronald, for walking us through it and, walking us through what it means. Hopefully for our viewers, certainly for me, this translates into a better understanding and appreciation of what the numbers mean currently or what they imply in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Bea, also.
Thank you for watching and joining us. We shall see you again next time. This has been Beko Pin. You've been watching Rappler. Bye.